Your morning coffee doesn't just block the signal that makes you tired. It goes into your kidneys and instructs them to stop reabsorbing sodium, the same sodium that, 6 hours later, your brain's fatigue receptor needs to stay in its off position. You're not crashing because the caffeine wore off. You're crashing partly because the caffeine spent the morning flushing the one thing that was helping to slow the crash down. The drug that wakes you up quietly removes part of the mechanism that keeps you awake. That's the loop almost nobody talks about. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Before we get into the mechanism, have you ever tried adding salt to your water, even once? Yes or no in the comments. I'm curious how many people have already stumbled onto this. Your brain produces a molecule all day long, every waking hour, as a direct byproduct of thinking. The more your brain works, the more of it accumulates. By afternoon, enough has built up that it starts pressing hard on the receptors designed to receive it, and when those receptors get the signal, you feel tired. That's not a malfunction. That's your brain's sleep timer doing exactly what it's supposed to do. Caffeine borrows time. It parks in those receptors and stops the signal landing. The tiredness is still accumulating behind it. When the caffeine clears, and it does, reliably, somewhere between 5 and 6 hours after you drink it, everything that built up while the receptors were blocked floods in simultaneously. Not gradually, the way it would have arrived without caffeine, all at once, which is why the crash feels worse than the original tiredness would have. You didn't prevent the fatigue. You deferred it, compressed it, and handed it back to yourself in a lump. That much, most people who've read about caffeine already know. What they don't know is the second mechanism, the one involving salt. Let's start with adenosine, the molecule at the center of all of this. Adenosine is produced when your neurons burn ATP, which is their primary fuel source. Burn energy, make adenosine. It's an unavoidable byproduct of brain activity itself, which means it accumulates proportionally to how hard and how long you've been thinking. Over a waking day, adenosine levels roughly double in the regions of the brain involved in sleep-wake regulation, particularly the basal forebrain, where adenosine is most concentrated and where its effects on alertness are most pronounced. It binds to two types of receptors, the A1 receptor and the A2A receptor. The adenosine type, 2A receptor. Both are involved in fatigue signaling, but the A2A receptor is particularly important for the afternoon crash story. And here's what's interesting. This receptor doesn't just have one binding site. It has two. The first is where adenosine actually docks what pharmacologists call the orthosteric site. The second is buried deeper inside the receptor's structure, in the middle of its 7 transmembrane helices. It's a separate pocket, a different address entirely. And what occupies it isn't adenosine or caffeine or anything you'd expect. It's a sodium ion, a single atom of salt, held inside the receptor. This wasn't theoretical. In 2012, researchers published a high-resolution X-ray crystal structure of the human A2A adenosine receptor, the first time anyone had photographed the inside of this receptor at atomic resolution. And sitting there, in that inner pocket, was a sodium ion surrounded by a small cluster of water molecules. The finding revealed something that had been suspected from pharmacological studies for decades, but never confirmed at structural level. Sodium acts as a negative allosteric modulator, a phrase that means, in plain language, it physically changes the shape of the receptor in a way that makes it harder for adenosine to bind. When sodium occupies that inner pocket, the receptor folds into a conformation that stabilizes its inactive state. It's less able to recognize adenosine, less able to fire the fatigue signal. Your own table salt, sitting inside your fatigue receptor, making it harder for tiredness to land. Put even more plainly, sodium keeps the receptor in its off position. Remove the sodium, and the receptor tilts more easily into its active state, more ready to receive adenosine, more ready to signal that you need to rest. So where does the coffee come in? Caffeine is a competitive adenosine receptor antagonist, meaning it competes directly with adenosine at the orthosteric site, the main binding site. That's the familiar part. But caffeine also does something else, something that operates through a completely different pathway and has nothing to do with the brain. It acts on your kidneys. Your kidneys contain adenosine receptors of their own. Specifically, adenosine A1 receptors line the proximal convoluted tubule the first stretch of the kidney's filtering system, responsible for reabsorbing somewhere between 60 and 70% of the sodium your body filters each day. These receptors, under normal circumstances, tell the tubule to pull sodium back into the bloodstream rather than letting it pass out in the urine. When caffeine blocks those receptors, that reabsorption signal gets muted. Less sodium gets reclaimed. More leaves in the urine. The technical term is natriuresis, the kidney excreting more sodium than usual. And research confirms it. Doses of caffeine above around 90 milligrams, which is less than a standard cup of coffee, have been shown to significantly increase urinary sodium excretion. A randomized crossover study published in Frontiers in Nutrition found measurable increases in urinary sodium following high caffeine coffee compared to water. A British Journal of Clinical Pharmacology study on high-dose caffeine intake found that changes in sodium clearance were closely correlated with caffeine's renal effects and supported the mechanism operating through adenosine receptor blockade in the proximal tubule. Your morning coffee is, among other things, a mild sodium excretion event. And if you have 2 cups, it's 2 sodium excretion events. The circuit now looks like this. You drink coffee. Caffeine blocks adenosine receptors in your brain. You feel alert. Simultaneously, caffeine blocks adenosine receptors in your kidneys. Sodium that would have been reclaimed passes out instead. Over the course of the morning, that sodium loss accumulates. Your overall sodium status edges marginally lower. And somewhere around mid-afternoon, when the caffeine is finally metabolized and the adenosine rebound arrives, the rush of backed-up tiredness flooding into now unblocked receptors, the receptor's inner sodium pocket is also less well stocked. 2 things go wrong at once. The adenosine rebound arrives, and the brake on the receptor that sodium normally provides is less functional than it would otherwise be. I'll be honest, the first time I worked through this mechanism properly, what struck me wasn't the complexity, it was how quietly it operates. You don't feel the sodium loss. You don't feel the receptor pocket gradually emptying. You just feel the crash, which you attribute entirely to the caffeine, because that's the explanation that's available. The second mechanism never gets named because nobody's trying to sell you a pinch of salt. Now, and this is worth being precise about, we're not talking about hyponatremia here. That's the clinical condition in which blood sodium falls dangerously low, producing confusion, nausea, seizures in severe cases. That requires either a medical condition, extreme overhydration, or sustained high-dose diuretics. We're talking about something subtler. The cumulative effect of mild increased sodium excretion across a morning of caffeine consumption, layered onto the existing adenosine rebound. Think of it less as a cliff and more as a slight gradient. The sodium pocket in the A2A receptor is sensitive to physiological concentrations of sodium, the normal range your body maintains. Small shifts within that range appear to influence receptor conformation. The research on this, as of the early 2020s, is clear at the structural and molecular pharmacology level. What's less clear and worth saying honestly is the precise magnitude of the effect in otherwise healthy adults drinking normal amounts of coffee. The mechanistic pathway is solid. The dose-response relationship in free-living humans going about their day hasn't been characterized at clinical scale. That's a gap. The pathway is real. How much it contributes individually, relative to the adenosine rebound on its own, isn't yet precisely quantified. What we do know is this. The sodium pocket is real. Its function as a negative allosteric modulator is confirmed by crystallography and molecular dynamics studies. Caffeine demonstrably increases urinary sodium excretion at common doses, and sodium status influences receptor conformation in a physiologically relevant way. The mechanism connects. The magnitude is where the science is still honest about what it doesn't know. There's a second line of evidence that's worth adding here, because it doesn't come from receptor pharmacology at all. It comes from the cognitive literature on sodium levels and brain function. Mild hyponatremia, blood sodium below 135 millimoles per liter, which is the clinical threshold, was for decades considered asymptomatic, not a problem worth addressing unless it was severe. Recent evidence has made that assumption harder to hold. A study published in the Clinical Journal of the American Society of Nephrology following over 5,000 older community-dwelling men for a median of 4.5 years, found that sodium levels in the range of 126 to 140 millimoles per liter were associated with 30% greater likelihood of cognitive impairment at baseline and 37% greater likelihood of cognitive decline over time, compared with those at 141 to 142 millimoles per liter. A separate analysis published in the Journal of the American Geriatric Society found that mild hyponatremia was associated with measurable deficits in attention and psychomotor function domains that map directly onto the cognitive experience of a crash. These are older populations. The data doesn't translate directly to a healthy adult who had 2 flat whites before noon. But the direction of the signal is consistent. Sodium and cognitive performance are not as disconnected as most people assume. The brain runs on sodium. Its receptors respond to sodium, and a lifestyle that quietly drains it faster than it's replaced may be contributing to an afternoon that feels harder than it needs to. Your kidneys filter your entire blood supply roughly every 30 minutes. Every pass, they're making decisions about what to reclaim and what to let go. Sodium is among the most tightly regulated things they manage. The body treats it like it matters, because it does. When caffeine tips that balance even marginally in the direction of greater excretion, it does so invisibly, persistently, across every cup. It's a bit like borrowing from a balance account you didn't know was load-bearing. The account doesn't send you a notification. You only notice when the overdraft lands. Which brings us to what the mechanism actually suggests you do about it. It's not complicated. The pathway tells you something obvious. If caffeine is one of the inputs driving down your sodium status across the morning, then replacing some of what's being lost is a reasonable response to the mechanism itself. Not a wellness protocol, not a supplement. A pinch of salt in a glass of water, something in the range of 1/8 of a teaspoon of table salt, dissolved in a glass of water, alongside your coffee, or with the glass of water you drink after it. Why alongside coffee specifically? Because that's when the natriuresis is happening. That's the window when the kidney's reabsorption of sodium is being suppressed. Replacing it then, rather than hours later, keeps the sodium picture more stable across the period when the receptor pocket matters most. By mid-afternoon, when the caffeine clears and the adenosine rebound arrives, you're not doing it into a receptor environment that's been further degraded by a morning of incremental sodium loss. The mechanism doesn't respond to enormous quantities of salt. It responds to adequate sodium staying in the range your body maintains and the receptor is calibrated for. More is not better here. The WHO recommends adults stay under 2,000 milligrams of sodium per day, roughly 5 grams of table salt. 1/8 of a teaspoon is about 300 milligrams. That's the scale we're operating at. Not a medical intervention, a correction. And here's the thing most people miss. Plain water can actually make the situation marginally worse if you're significantly sodium depleted. Drinking large amounts of plain water when sodium is already on the low side dilutes what's there. Further, a fact that explains why electrolyte solutions consistently outperform plain water in hydration studies when sodium depletion is part of the picture. Salt in water isn't a trend or a supplementation fad. It's what hospitals have administered through drips for over a century because fluid balance without electrolytes doesn't actually work. The short version of everything above: your brain is running a sleep timer. Caffeine holds it back. But caffeine also, via your kidneys, gradually reduces the sodium that helps keep the timer's receptor less sensitive to the signal. By afternoon, both the timer and the receptor's sodium brake have shifted in the same direction toward the crash. Replacing the sodium closes the second half of the loop. The first half, the adenosine rebound, is unavoidable because you can't stop adenosine accumulating without stopping your brain from working. But the second half is addressable with 1/8 of a teaspoon of something that costs almost nothing. The understanding is what makes the action obvious. You're not boosting anything. You're not hacking anything. You're returning a receptor to the sodium concentration it was designed to operate in the context of a morning habit that was quietly moving that concentration in the wrong direction. One more thing worth saying before this ends. Every few years, the wellness industry discovers salt. It puts it in a pink box from a Himalayan mountain, or suspends it in a brightly colored powder, or sells it as an athletic performance system. The mechanism is real. The salt doesn't care what box it came from. Regular table salt, ideally iodized, does what the receptor needs. The packaging is for you. The sodium is for the pocket. Tell me in the comments, did you already know caffeine was affecting your sodium levels, or is that the part of this that changed how you think about the crash? The responses that push back hardest on the mechanism are the ones I find most useful. The last thing to sit with, you've been calling it a caffeine crash, and it is. But it's also a sodium story that's been running quietly underneath it, every morning, every cup, unannounced. That's the part the research knows. That's the part worth knowing.